Welcome back to every naval battle in history. In this episode, we take on the last Carthaginian victory ever, and with it the end of the Third Punic War, the end of Carthage, the end of a whole vast and glittering civilisation. And for that matter, the end of our playlist on the Punic Wars. We've been happy to have those shipmates who've jumped on board this way, and we hope you choose to stick around for the rest of the ride. Writing this episode was a sad business that I've started more than once. Carthage dominated the western Mediterranean Sea for most of the first millennium BCE. As covered in this channel, the first known battle involving Phoenician ships was not the forces of Tyre or Sidon, but those of Carthage. Episode 4, the Battle of Alalia, 535 BCE. After the end of the Second Punic War, Carthage was forbidden to keep a navy, or war elephants, or to wage war without the express consent of Rome. Considering what Hannibal had done for 17 years in Italy, during which time 1 in 6 Roman men had died in the fighting, this was a fairly lenient treaty, and the indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver was 1/3 less than that inflicted on the Seleucid Empire a handful of years later. Hannibal himself had been allowed to run for election and had governed the city of Carthage for 5 years before his efforts to reform their government had angered the moneyed interests and they'd essentially run him out of town. Carthage couldn't help itself and just kept making more money than the Romans could dream of, paying off the war indemnity with ease. Interestingly, modern archaeology suggests the great war harbour of Carthage was built between the Second and Third Wars, which would have justified Roman alarm at the city's recovery. So Carthage had money, and if there's one thing a Roman senator both has a lot of and wants a lot more of, it's money. And Carthage was rearming on the sly. The last time the Romans sat back and watched Carthage rearm, they got Hannibal rampaging around Italy for 17 years, firing up leftover Greeks and unhappy hill tribes. Throw into the mix, Cato the Elder was screaming Carthago delenda est in the Senate every time they let him speak. On top of all this, you've got relative calm in the Greek East, and a political system whereby if a consul doesn't have an army to lead to war, they're really missing out on making some money. Remember what I just said about Roman senators and money. Carthage had it coming, and Rome intended to give it to them. Important context was at the end of the Second War, the Numidians, who had been at the source of cavalry which had been essential to Hannibal's success, decided they'd had enough of being shackled to the Phoenician interlopers, and they wanted their land back. The Romans regarded the Numidians as an ally, and their increasing raids on Carthaginian territory would normally have been put down, but Rome would not give Carthage permission to retaliate. In 151 BCE, Carthage raised an army without permission. The army was slaughtered by the Numidians, and the Carthaginians then sentenced their commander Hasdrubal, yes, another one, to death, trying to shift the blame for the fiasco onto him. Not an auspicious way to declare a new independence. In 151, Carthage also made the final colossal payment of silver to Rome. With the benefit of hindsight, this was a very dangerous position to be in. When you're shipping silver to Rome, they have a reason not to attack you. But when the sweet silver dries up, well, it's hard to hold back the dogs of war when they aren't getting their tummy rubbed, isn't it? In 149 BCE, the city of Utica, to the north of Carthage, allied itself with Rome, possibly seeing the writing on the wall, possibly reviving centuries-old rivalry between the cities, or maybe a bit of both. This gave the Romans a large harbour within striking distance, and soon after a large Roman army landed in Utica to move south and deal with Carthage. The Carthaginians tried to appease the Romans and agreed to be disarmed. 200,000 sets of armour and 2,000 catapults were surrendered, and all their warships were built in the harbour of Utica, which must have been quite the sight. Having handed over all their war material, the Carthaginians were given a new demand. They had to move the city 10 miles from the sea and abandon commerce and trade. For maritime people, with a society built entirely around trade, this was seen for what it was, a death sentence. Even if they'd done it, you can't imagine the Numidians would have left them in peace for long. In a totally untenable position, they broke off the talks and prepared to defend the city. a task that would have been easier if they still had their 2,000 catapults and their warships. Carthage still had colossal walls, 20 metres high and 9 metres wide, and they sprang Hasdrubal from death row to command the army. They also freed their slaves. Happy days, slaves! You're now full members of a doomed society. In 147 BCE, they attempted a naval breakout with reconstituted forces. Now, in World War II, the US Air Force took this photo of the ancient ports of Carthage. Today, a similar scene can be seen on Google Maps, or even on Street View. Given that Polybius was actually present for the siege of Carthage, the descriptions of the naval battle are surprisingly hazy. But a force of some 50 triremes broke out through a canal the Romans were not aware of. They attacked the blockading Roman fleet, and apparently had a lot of success, but were eventually in danger of being overwhelmed by the Roman numbers. They turned back to port, inflicting more damage on the Romans, trying to cut them off. Apparently a majority made it back into port, and even the Romans considered the affair to have been a Carthaginian victory, although without achieving very much at all. Incidentally, one of the Roman naval commanders was one Lucius Hostilius Mancinus. The Mancini family, who are very much still big cheeses in modern Italy, trace a line of descent to him. Finally, in 146 BCE, the Romans under Scipio Aemilianus, the adoptive grandson of the first Scipio Africanus, breached the mighty walls of Carthage. Over 6 days the Romans worked through the city, murdering the civilian population and setting fire to the buildings. On the 6th day the Romans agreed to take prisoners, except for 900 Roman deserters who promptly barricaded themselves in the temple of Eshmun. Talk about making a bad bet, deserting from Rome to Carthage in the final days. Hasdrubal surrendered to Scipio, which prompted his wife to curse him and take her children to the temple, which was soon burning down, the last holdouts inside defiant to the absolute end. Carthage would be deserted until 29 BCE, when Augustus re-established a Roman city on the site, which was too good to leave vacant. The fields were not sown with salt. That's a modern invention, and frankly salt was expensive stuff back then. So passed a mighty empire of traders and craftsmen. Their literature was utterly obliterated. 50,000 survivors were taken as slaves. I think it can be argued that the wealth of their society outstripped their institutional capacity to defend that wealth, and the merchants who held that money resisted efforts to make the needed reforms, most famously by Hannibal after the Second Punic War. In the end, they allowed themselves to be both too threatening to Rome to ignore, and also a very wealthy prize to be taken. It's also worth remembering that they started the first 2 wars, but without plans to win them, often due to the actions of individuals at the edges of their empire, not as the result of any concerted strategy. It's a sad tale worthy of telling. In 1985, that's 1985 in the modern era, not that long ago, the mayors of Rome and Carthage would finally sign a peace treaty between their cities. Strap in, folks, we've got lots more to cover as we take on every naval battle in history. Smash those like and subscribe buttons, ring that bell, you don't want to get left behind.